experience with Amway is me and my father joined in 2001, and at the time they weren't calling themselves Amway; they were calling themselves A2K. It was all about e-commerce and internet shopping, and you need to get into it now before it explodes. That was sort of the mentality at the time. So you still there?
Yeah, go right ahead.
I basically, within about 2 weeks, I could see there was drastic problems with Amway, but my dad couldn't. He thought then that it was the greatest thing of all time, and that it was going to make him a multi-millionaire, and that caused a lot of conflict between me and him because we were arguing about it just constantly. And to this day, he still thinks he's going to become a multi-millionaire from it, even though he's made almost no money at all. So,
do you think he's not made money, or do you think he's lost money?
He made a little bit of money for a short period of time, but the problem was his whole group then. So the problem for my dad is not so much the ability to get people in, but the ability to get them to stay. So he signed a lot of people, but they all quit. Just over and over again, that you get them in and they leave. You get them in and they leave. So I don't think it's possible for someone to have worked harder on it than what he's worked on it. So I get very angry when I hear people say that people who fail are just lazy. They don't follow the plan. They don't follow the system, because he could not have followed it any more. He could not have worked any harder. He sponsored lots of people, but there's a problem with the system and there's a problem with the business, really.
Yeah, and you were telling me when we were talking on the Facebook voice app over the past several days, Glenn, that he had an interesting occupation and how he applied his contacting technique. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, well, he was a taxi driver. So when you think about it, being a taxi driver is the absolute perfect job for somebody in an MLM. So what he would do is he would prospect every single person that got into his taxi. So we're talking, 20 or 30 people a day, every single day. And he had a lot of success in actually signing a lot of these people up. But again, none of them stayed around for very long. And the other thing that made it, I guess, good or bad, depending on how you want to look at it, is that as a taxi driver, probably for 70 or 80% of the time, there's nobody in the taxi. So all that time, he would be listening to the Amway tape or the Amway CD. So he was living this thing like he was either prospecting people or he was listening to stories from other Amway IBOs. So it was just, for him, it was all consuming. So he'd do that. He'd work in the taxi for 12 hours a day. He'd then come home. He'd then quickly get changed and he'd go off to a meeting, or he'd go off to show somebody the plan. So it was all consuming all the time, really. But yeah, sadly, like nothing is, for him, it's just been a disaster.
And what did you find objectionable? You said you lasted 2 weeks. I mean, what did you find objectionable about Amway, or I guess as they called it, A2K, back in those days in Australia? And by the way, Amway changed their name in the United States between 1999 and 2007 to Quickstar, Q-U-I-X-T-A-R. And I would probably guess, I don't know this for a fact, but I would, kind of surmise that A2K came from, that idea of let's change the name, because we are going on the internet and we want to get rid of the A word, Amway. And go ahead.
Absolutely. So when you were prospected with it, it was a flat out, this is e-commerce. If someone didn't think it was a good idea, they would sort of laugh at you and say, okay, so you don't think that e-commerce and internet shopping is going to become better, and they would just laugh at the person and make the person feel ridiculous. That was the sort of the sales tactic, pretty much. Anyone that didn't think it was a great idea was just a really ignorant person who didn't think there was a future in e-commerce. But the reality is that the business has nothing to do with e-commerce. It's about going up to people and prospecting them. That's what it's about, and convincing them that you can turn them into a multi-millionaire doing, 6 hours a week of work, or, this sort of, you can become rich in your spare time sort of business, which just is not true.
Yeah, and what part of the business did you find objectionable? Because you said you lasted only 2 weeks. You were a pretty young man at that time, right? In the 18-year-old neighborhood.
18.
Right.
So I think the final straw, there was a meeting on, and it was $235 per ticket. So it would have been $470 for me and Dad to go. And the sponsor was just relentless. Got to go to this. I went to this last year, and this is what turned it around. This will change your life. And I'm like, nah, I'm not paying $235 to sit in the stadium and listen to some people talk. It was very obvious that there was nobody was trying to sell any products to any customers. The products were clearly overpriced. When they would have my dad's sponsor was very, very charismatic, but he wouldn't tell anybody what the business was. He talked for an hour and a half, and he wouldn't say what they had to do. It was all just about how bad jobs were and about everything. Also, the part I find interesting about Amway is they're always talking about positivity, right? According to, if you listen to people at Amway meetings, the real estate market's always about to collapse. The share market's always about to collapse. They were saying that, Australia was there's a deficit, therefore they're not going to have pensions in 20 years. Well, we're now 21 years later, and there's still pensions. They're catastrophizing everything. Everything's going to collapse except for their business. And we're here 20 years later, and there's none of what they said has actually happened. So it was, mainly nobody was selling anything, and it was all, I could see then, it was all about buying these tapes and these books and these guys, speaking in stadiums in front, $235. How ridiculous a price is that for a ticket?
Yeah, that's a lot of money, especially for a young person. You were probably just getting into the workforce and everything, and that would have been. Now, where was that function? Did you have to travel, or was it in Melbourne or the Melbourne area?
It was Melbourne. It was probably about 30 minutes from from my house, maybe 45 minutes away. I think everything's quite centralised in Melbourne. So Melbourne has about, I think, 5 million people, and yeah, things are quite centralised here. So, but that was a stadium event where there would have been 15,000 people.
Right. Yeah.
Seats from $235.
In a way, you got off easy from the standpoint that many people, including myself when I was in Amway, we had to travel across the country normally to go to these functions that cost about what you were describing. I don't know what the Australian-U.S. dollar relationship is or was 20 years ago, but that sounds about the same that we were paying. Plus, you had the travel costs and the hotels and the meals. So the ticket was just a piece of the price. The other costs were even, multiple times the ticket price. So it's you got sort of quote unquote lucky being in Melbourne. But it sounds like it just wasn't something that you were interested in. Now, I think Australia is one of those countries that does not require retail sales to non-distributors. And so what fuels the Amway company is the distributors buying and using the products themselves and finding new distributors to do the same thing. And so, that part of it, the lack of sales, is not against, as far as I know, it's not against any Australian laws. And in fact, I think several years ago I came across some information where the Amway rules in Australia do not require retail sales. So, the Amway rules differ from country to country. So it's just kind of an interesting dynamic. Go ahead.
There's absolutely no attempt here at all to make any retail sales, like zero. Actually, so I forgot one thing too. One of the main red flags was we invited a heap of friends over to the house, and the charismatic sponsor spoke, and he told his story, and he said that he made his first order, and it was just stuff that he would have bought anyway. So which isn't true. It's stuff that you normally wouldn't buy. But he said, I just did my normal grocery shopping, but rather than going into Coles and making Coles rich, I instead bought through my own business, and I got a $50 check. Now, that is just, to get a $50 check back, he would have needed to have spent thousands and thousands of dollars. That was clearly that was a clear lie. I picked that up straight away. I remember thinking that, to me, was a huge red flag too.
Right. Now, if he had